Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you here today and to be introducing you to a really great discussion on democracy in Africa. We are here today to talk about Rebecca Tapscott's new book, Arbitrary States, which is fantastic, in which I have a copy of here because it's so good. Full disclosure, it's come out in the book series for OUP that I helped to edit. And it's a really important book about the way that power is used to sustain authoritarianism. And I'm particularly excited about this book because I think it has really important things to tell us, not just about Uganda under Museveni, but about authoritarian regimes in the world today more generally. To discuss the book, we of course have Rebecca herself. Rebecca is an Ambizione Fellow at the Albert Hirschman Center at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. And to discuss with her, we're very glad and very honored to be able to welcome Gerald Bareebe, who's an assistant professor of politics at York University, currently based in Kampala. Thank you very much to both of you for giving us your time. We're going to start by giving Rebecca an opportunity to bring out some of the key arguments and themes about the book, and then we'll move into the discussion. So Rebecca, welcome to Democracy in Africa. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. And again, I'm really excited to be talking about the book. Really delighted to have Gerald here, who in a former life was a journalist. So I'm sure we'll be able to add lots of color to the conversation. And I think, Nic, you framed the book really well from the outset in terms of what I'm trying to do with it. And so this book really starts with this question of how authoritarian regimes maintain control in context of democratic institutions. And this is a really important puzzle. Authoritarianism, as many people have sort of noted, is on the rise. And the vast majority of authoritarian regimes also have democratic institutions, like elections, separation of powers, and other civic spaces that citizens could theoretically use to hold rulers accountable. So I take this puzzle and I study it in the context of states with comparatively limited capacity. And by limited capacity, I really just mean the very kind of straightforward, obvious definition of states that can't necessarily monopolize violence across their territory or reliably provide services to their citizens. And these contexts further emphasize the puzzle that I'm interested in because they may not be able to reliably repress their citizenry, and their failure to provide services might mean that citizens have sort of more dissatisfaction. So then how do these regimes maintain control over society? My book tries to answer this question by studying one such regime, Museveni's Uganda. And Uganda is a good example of a modern authoritarian regime because it has regularly used the rule of law to sort of roll back roadblocks on executive power. So I spent nearly a year in Uganda between 2014 and 2018, studying really local governance dynamics to try to understand authoritarianism from below. And so now I'll just talk sort of briefly about the key findings. So the book really looks at informal security actors like militias, vigilantes, community police, and their relationship to state security providers. And these local violent actors kind of sit at the boundary between licit and illicit, constructive and corrosive, and these other kind of binaries that we associate with the state. And in this way, they can help kind of understand how those divisions and boundaries between the concepts are kind of constituted to understand how authority is produced at a local level. And so the book then kind of responds to or engages with this existing political science and sort of theory on the formation of local governance actors. And this idea that sort of local violent entrepreneurs might try to consolidate their authority to extract more resources from society in what some people have called kind of a fertile place between the state and society. So for example, one really well-known study by Anton Bloch looks at how the mafia gradually gained power until it dominated the space between local communities and the central state, becoming a governance actor in its own right. So my idea was to look in Uganda at the local level to see how existing violent actors might try to consolidate their authority similarly. What I found both resonated with this theory, but also was very different in some key ways. So first, I did identify lots of different sort of local violent actors, including vigilantes and sort of community security groups, and that they often were formed sort of with the approval of state actors and in contexts where crime was really high. So, you know, the police and local government officials would go to a community and say, we can't solve your problem, but maybe you can form a local security group and deal with it. And these groups did try to consolidate power. They would enforce local bylaws, they would, make uniforms and ID cards, and they would charge fees for their services and even sometimes have local taxation processes. But despite their best efforts, they were largely unable to really consolidate meaningfully. Instead, they were sort of fragmented when state authorities would intervene unpredictably to reassert their authority over the situation. So for instance, charging vigilantes with using too much violence, even though when the groups were initially formed, they sort of implicitly or explicitly suggest that they do so. And so what I see is this constant kind of tug and push and pull over jurisdictional boundaries, and that those assertions and denials of state authority are really backed by meaningful possibility for overwhelming violence, and that this keeps these groups both existing but also very fragile, such that the space between state and society is not fertile, as some would describe, but actually very inhospitable to the emergence of local governance actors. So the implications then are twofold. First, democratic institutions and civic spaces can continue to exist. They just become highly fragile and fragmented, making it difficult for citizens to organize and make successful claims on state actors. And following on from this, state authorities are able to outsource much of the day-to-day responsibilities associated with providing security and justice while decreasing the risk of losing control.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca, for explaining the content of your book and the key findings of your book. And I think your book makes a very important contribution for understanding the nature and the changing dynamic of authoritarianism in Africa. In terms of the trends that you see emerging in the research on authoritarianism in Africa, what do you consider to be the key trends in that research? And what does it say about the state of comparative politics research?
Yeah, that's a great question, especially because we really have seen, I think, this area grow massively, at least under those particular sort of titles, right, in recent years, on sort of populist governance, but also especially on authoritarian institutions, right? This is a really growing area of scholarship. And I think there's a really important trend toward bringing African cases into conversation with scholarship around the world, and seeing them really as a place of equal ability to generate theory and explanations for what we are seeing around the world, in the vein of countries like Hungary, Poland, Brazil, Mexico, that there may have been more sort of theorizing about in the past. And at the same time, we really need more of this, right? And we need to be able to tell more complex and interrelated stories. It's not that African cases are the same as those found in other parts of the world. They have these colonial legacies and have been subject to massive violence and global extraction, but that the fundamental behaviors and dynamics that we might observe are equally informative about human behavior and governance. And so here, I think that where my project really contributes is first trying to theorize from an African case, and looking not just at how individual institutions work, but the sort of landscape of institutions collectively and how they shape governance. And then I guess the third part is really linking comparative politics to international relations, to sort of try to lay out the point that we can't really understand states like Uganda without seeing them within their global and historic context as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, Africa is one of the continents that is still struggling with authoritarianism or illiberal democracies, you would say. And when you compare the regime of President Museveni with other authoritarian regimes on the continent, I mean, you could think of, for example, Rwanda or Zimbabwe under Mugabe, or Egypt, or Tunisia, or even North Africa, Central Africa, East Africa, and some parts of Southern Africa. Like, the continent is still dominated by regimes that you cannot say that these are in any sense democratic regimes. But comparatively, as someone who has studied Museveni's regime, do you find the Museveni regime somewhat different from other African authoritarian regimes, for example, you have encountered or studied?
Yeah, that's such a like difficult question, right? Like, of course, yes and no. One of the things that I'm really struck by is sort of when looking across these cases, and also sort of in studies of authoritarianism, particularly these kind of authoritarian regimes in low capacity states, is the extent to which rulers really have limited options in a lot of cases. They sort of have to work with this pre-existing set of institutions and power holders, and that there are a lot of path dependencies and sort of very sticky institutions that can be largely historically contingent and make every case very unique. But then we also see how rulers learn from one another, right, and share tactics and strategies. And there's been recent studies, for example, by Kinley and Shepley, looking at indeed how rulers actually meet and sort of, you know, trade notes, as well as other scholars. So in the book, I do kind of try to drill down and look more specifically at some key comparators that you actually named briefly in the conclusion. So it's kind of an exploratory area, certainly ripe for further research. But I look, sort of narrow my comparison to look at other so-called liberation regimes that took power in East African countries, including the RPF in Rwanda, ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe, and the EPRDF in Ethiopia, because these regimes arguably face similar governance challenges to the NRM in Uganda. And I do find some similar approaches to governance in each of these regimes, such that we might characterize them as, to some extent, arbitrary regimes, right? But at the same time, they differ really importantly in key ways. So looking at ZANU-PF, here is a regime that has really weakened state institutions to the extent that the regime has much more limited and sporadic control outside of the capital, as contrasted with a regime like the NRM, where, you know, I argue at least that the state presence is really felt even in these very remote corners of the country. Or in Ethiopia, ethnic federalism allowed key fault lines to remain in place, unlike in Rwanda and Uganda, where ethnicity was subsumed more under sort of a new national identity, Rwandicity in Rwanda, and sort of the movement system in Uganda. So to me, these differences really helped highlight sort of actually the utility of a framework to think about unpredictable or arbitrary governance, highlighting different levels of regime reliance on jurisdictional fluidity, violence, surveillance, and institutional fragmentation.
Yeah.
Can I come in there? Gerald, can I come in there quickly? Because I think that's a really good answer. But one of the things I also really like about the book, and sorry, Gerald, if this is a question you're about to ask, is I really like that you don't assume that everywhere's the same within Uganda. And one of the things that I think the book does well is to break Uganda down and to talk about different parts of different areas in Uganda that have different contexts, and to then think about what that means. And I think, you know, that subnational analysis is something that we really, you know, good comparative subnational analysis is something that can be so enriching. So Rebecca, I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that. I mean, maybe for people who are interested in the book, where in Uganda do you go? What are the sorts of variations that come out from being able to do that kind of subnational comparison, and not just being located in one area, being able to think a little bit about how the strategies that you've been talking about might vary across space?
Yeah, that's such an important question. And I think, you know, for scholars of Uganda or for Ugandans, people focused on this country context, they will keenly note that the theory of the book was initially developed in northern Uganda and Ngulu, right? And in many ways, this is sort of a most likely case to observe what I describe as arbitrary or unpredictable governance, in the sense that, you know, it's been highly conflict affected. Now the conflict sort of came to a close quite a few years ago, but during the field research, it was more recent. And so highly conflict affected, and also, you know, well known, at least, you know, up to the period of research, as a place that was not favorable to the regime opposition area. And so, you know, in this sense, we might think that either governance there, and compared to other areas of the country, would actually be more unpredictable or arbitrary due to these legacies of conflict, or that people might frame or interpret the government as more arbitrary and more maliciously so due to their animosity to the government. And so I think, in that sense, it was a very great field site to develop this argument and theory and really observe the dynamics that I tried to describe. But perhaps not the best one to argue that the government itself is actually could be characterized as arbitrary. So I then went to 3 other parts of the country to vary on indeed conflict effectiveness and kind of relationship to the ruling regime, or sort of opposition and sort of pro-government areas. And those included Mbarara, Soroti, and Moroto, all sort of urban centers and surrounding areas. And what I found was really, really interesting. First, all of the field sites showed aspects of arbitrary governance, and people really expressing very strongly the view that the government's actions were very unpredictable, and that their governing environment was unpredictable in terms of, who might be responsible for any sort of justice or security claim that people might want to make, but that it did really manifest in different ways. So just by way of example, in Mbarara, which, is where the Museveni is from, and certainly a regime stronghold, this sort of source of unpredictability came less from experiences of violence, but more from both seeing violence perpetrated by the government in other parts of the country. So there's a strong narrative about what the Northern War was like, but also a very strong perception of surveillance, more so, I would say, than in other areas of the country. And I propose that this has something to do with the proximity of the ruling elite to this area. And that could be further explored. And then in Moroto, it was quite interesting as well, in the sense that these government interventions were much less at an individual level, like what we see kind of in Gulu area, but more at a community-wide level. So these processes of armament and disarmament that occurred in that area that made the entire community vulnerable to violence from, other cattle raiders or other communities at the same time. And so, I again link this to sort of the very peripheral nature of Moroto and the government's kind of continued efforts to expand control over that region.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Actually, yes. So it's a very, very elaborate answer to the question. Yeah, I'm actually very happy because I was in Moroto recently, and when I went through your book, I thought, okay, so if you did your fieldwork in Guru, a lot of time you were in Guru, and then you went to Moroto. So Guru and Moroto, they are more or less like post-conflict regions, you would say. And then you have Mbarara, which is, of course, the heartland of Museveni's regime, and Soroti, equally, which has been supportive of Museveni for some time, probably you could say until recently. But to what extent, for example, is the state approach in terms of coercion or arbitrariness, like you put it in your book, is a function of post-conflict environment, in a way that probably maybe the state in this case is still undergoing sort of like for Moroto, you would say it is still sort of like a pacification exercise. So to what extent do you think the post-conflict environment played a role in some of this approach of the state in those areas?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I mean, that's exactly why I tried to go to places in Uganda that were less conflict affected to kind of develop the test to probe that explanation, right? Yeah. Now, obviously, because of Uganda's history, most places have everywhere has some history of conflict, right? And it's just different in particular. And so I do try to kind of account for that and discuss it in the book. I think where your question really points to me that is interesting and an area that I really hope to explore more in future research is how the longer historical trajectory of the way the nation was formed and kind of these transitions in power and the liberation movement itself may have shaped a regime that within it has internal contradictions. And sort of this, so I'm working on a new piece actually that's about rebel governance and the sort of RC system in Uganda, looking in particular at how, when you are waging a war like that, you need to be able both to control society and get them on board, but also see all of society as a potential threat, right? Anybody could betray you at any time. And sort of looking at how building a system like this that both allows you to claim authority, but try to push responsibility elsewhere may have longer term legacies.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Of course, this is a very, very important book coming up at this time. But for students of political science, in what ways do you think this book is actually very useful for them for understanding the governance in some of these authoritarian societies?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things, I guess, that I would highlight. The first one is maybe sort of going back to that initial point about like how we think about African cases in relation to political science scholarship, especially in Northern contexts. And so one of the things that the book does is it tries to put into conversation, or does put into conversation, scholarship on modern authoritarianism and scholarship on the African state. And as I was writing, I thought this was quite interesting because here you have a bunch of scholars who are sort of thinking, how is it possible to have democratic institutions alongside authoritarian rule? How do we have this disjunct between institutions and enforcement capacity? And then you look to scholarship on the African state and this very long-standing conversation on exactly that topic, right? And so obviously, there's this question of the relationship between regimes and states and, sort of how we link these two scholarships. But I think that one can be very informative to the other. And so that's one thing that I try to set out that I think could be useful to students who are interested in either of those debates or how those debates might fit together, as well as thinking about how to bring together scholarships that have different trajectories or backgrounds. The other things that I would highlight, I guess, are that the book really shows the importance of unpredictability in governance, right? So as political scientists, we often see unpredictability as something that we should sort of be able to account for, whether with better data or better models. But my project actually tries to put unpredictability at the center of its analysis to explore how it might matter or be important to governance on its own terms. And then I also try to explain how unpredictability can sort of work and be sustained. So I developed this model in the book that we've kind of referred to a little bit that tries to understand what happens when relationships that are sort of assumed to be integral to the notion of the modern the modern state don't stabilize, but instead they actually remain in flux. And so it explores three factors that are actually quite sort of common in many political science studies of governance, which are violence, surveillance, and institutional fragmentation. But then it also includes a fourth element, and that is the role of jurisdiction, or sort of who is able to claim authority over what events, people, and places. And when jurisdiction is fluid, it means that ordinary people don't necessarily know who will be in charge of a given situation. And as a result, they don't know what rules will be applied. And this means that they may have difficulty making the kinds of rational calculations in pursuit of self-interest assumed by most political science governance theories. And that might help explain why we might see outcomes that differ so substantially from some existing theories.
Great. I just want to come in again before we go back to Gerald, if that's okay, because this is one of the things that I think is most interesting and important about the book, the relationship with uncertainty connects very much with the arbitrariness. And I think there's two different aspects of which are starting to be picked up in the literature, having been much neglected. And one is uncertainty when it comes to individuals at the local level. What is the state going to do to me today? How do I respond? How does that affect the population? The other is perhaps a sort of more national level, the uncertainty that political leaders face. And so you were talking there about, rebel governance, and anybody could betray you at any one point in time. And I think this is something that we don't think about enough. I mean, most of the time when I engage with leaders, I get the sense that one, they don't really trust the information they're necessarily getting. They're quite distrustful of it. They know that a lot of people in their team are going to tell them nice things because these are people in their team. And so they're slightly worried about that. They always kind of have one inkling that somewhere in the country there's a rebellion that's going on that they need to get to that they haven't realized about. And so they kind of are operating under conditions often of quite low levels of information, or at least questionable information. And that sort of uncertainty, I often find, generates a sort of response, which is, well, if I don't know what's coming, I better batten down all the hatches. And so I remember having a conversation with one leader about an election where I was saying, well, it looks from a lot of the analysis like you're going to win, so you don't really need to manipulate this election, do you? And the response was, well, you would say that, but I'm not willing to take the chance. And so you end up getting these kind of responses that appear irrational from perhaps a political science, methodology, but actually make perfect sense in the context in which the individuals are operating. So I wonder if you could say maybe just a little bit more about the government side, the Museveni side, as it were, of this, because we talked a bit a moment ago about the localities, but how do you actually see governments operating? How does uncertainty impact on presidents and prime ministers and legislators in your kind of framework?
Yeah, I'll put out there that that's sort of outside my expertise, if one will, right? Like the project is really based in local experiences and views of the state. But speculatively, I think that's a great question. And one of the things when you were talking that really it was making me think of is just the importance of mistrust and how that really fragments and weakens and, reshapes and misforms relationships, but in a way that, as you were saying, when we apply political science theories that sort of are assuming that everybody's trying to optimize information exchange, that's just not what is happening, and it's not the perceptions that people have, and trust is not rewarded, right? And so I think as you were describing, that really is highlighted there, that this pervasive mistrust, and actually I'm sure some of your work as well on social media and kind of how that's been influencing elections and kind of politics as well, and the sort of the misinformation there would be really interesting to sort of link to as well.
Thank you. Follow up on that. I mean, your book has a very interesting introduction, and it speaks a lot, for example, about the trust that you are talking about, trust between Ugandans, for example, and the police or the other security organs. So, I mean, I would say President Museveni has somewhat perfected the system in which he creates so many different security organs, some of them with competing roles and unclear mandates. So we are talking about uncertainty. So in an event that there is a likelihood of a transition from Museveni, and that is likely to be a period of uncertainty, what role do you see some of these different security organs that have been created, some of them with unclear mandates, some of them who operate in the background, like what role do you see them likely to play? I mean, this is a speculative question as well, but what role do you really see these different auxiliary security groups likely to play in an event that we get a transition from President Yoweri Museveni?
Yeah, I mean, now we're getting into the realm of your area of expertise, probably. But yeah, I mean, I think this is really a question of essentially how the structure holds, and who is able to step to the fore to hold things together or not, as it may be. And I think what the most frightening picture is none, right? And that this system of sort of all against all displays its ugliest colors. Now, obviously, yeah, again, like I that's your area. Maybe I should turn it over to you and see what you think would happen. But it's a good time for the video to freeze.
Okay, sorry. I think I had lost you briefly, but okay. So the other question I wanted to ask you. you is about your fieldwork experience. So the other question I wanted to ask you is about your fieldwork experience in Uganda. What was your experience and what were your challenges conducting fieldwork in Uganda? And how did you overcome those challenges?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I feel I'm kind of continually going back to and reflecting on, again, both in terms of like how I think about my data, but also kind of my ongoing relationships and friends. So yeah, it's a really important question also for students and scholars. I think, one thing that strikes me is that we often emphasize the Political Science Academy often emphasizes the amount of time that people spend in the field is almost like a marker of legitimacy or something. And I will say that, spending a lot of time in the field did sort of allow me to build deeper relationships. In particular, going back and forth was really helpful over several years, because I was both able to develop sort of strong relationships, but also to see how things changed actually on the ground over that time. And so, for example, there were cases that I followed that were never resolved over, these 4 or 5 years. And even when I follow up with people now, maybe still not be resolved, but I was able to see how the life of the conflict, if you will, changed over time. I also, I guess, would just note that there's this long sort of tradition about thinking about ethics and relationality and positionality in the field from multiple different sort of traditions. And for me, one thing that's quite interesting is so Anastasia, I'm not going to be able to say her name, so I won't try. But she's written about fear and empathy in the field, and how sort of interviewing, in her case, perpetrators of violence was difficult with these two different dynamics. And so for me, in terms of thinking about my own work, sometimes I think about empathy, but also kind of linking, I guess, to what we were saying earlier, mistrust or trust on the other side, and kind of how we might sort of pair these two very different feelings that you can have when doing research. So empathy, I guess, because when I step back and look at my research, what I really see is a bunch of people, most of whom are making their good faith effort to do their best in a very contentious, challenging system, ranging from, vigilantes who are just trying to sort of uphold the local order, but really in a difficult place between the demands of their communities and the demands of the state, to, police officers who are, charged with helping uphold a particular regime agenda on the one hand, but also seen as responsible for policing and local crime from community members' views on the other, right? So the people really are trying. But then on the other hand, Uganda also, or I shouldn't say but, and on the other hand, Uganda has a long tradition of foreign researchers like myself coming and asking these kinds of questions. I am a well-known commodity as a researcher. And so, when people decide to talk to me, I have to sort of think about that as well. What are they sort of goals from their perspective of the conversation, and how might that shape what we're talking about? So for me, this tension between empathy and doubt was really productive in some ways, I think, pushing me to try to pursue comprehension and really reconsidering and examining what we say in pursuit of that. But it certainly also can be, challenging as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe just to follow up on that, for students of political science who probably want to conduct fieldwork in a challenging environment like Uganda, in a non-democratic country like Uganda, from your experience and the kind of data you collected, it's very difficult to collect the kind of data you collected without having like access and creating this kind of rapport with the people that you interviewed. What kind of strategies can you share with someone who wants to conduct fieldwork in that kind of environment, especially on how to get the data, how to gain access,
Yeah, I guess my view is that everyone is really different, and that we can't it's, you know, of course, there's general things that people will say, but to me, you know, being very sort of frank and honest about the project that I have, kind of the questions that I have, who I am, where I'm coming from, and also making very, being very open to people in terms of answering their questions about my research, what I'm finding, and allowing sort of for correctives as well from their perspectives was really important. But in terms of like generalizable insights beyond that, I guess I would sort of say, you know, talk to your colleagues, talk to, you know, to your networks and make new networks, people in the field, and yeah, to approach those situations with openness and care. Yeah.
That's a great answer, and I think your care word is a good one. I think also, you know, not rushing things, right? If you're going to ask people about really difficult things, don't expect you can run into a community, ask, you know, do 20 interviews in 2 weeks and leave. You know, you need to build up those relationships, and you need to, you know, pay your dues, but you also need to spend time on the ground and get to know people. And I think, you know, one of the challenges at the minute is that with funding for PhDs, you know, being cut, and a lot of people doing PhDs without full funding, it's hard to do, you know, spend that time in the field and really develop those relationships. But it is critical, not just for your work, but to do respect for the communities that you're working within. We're coming towards the end of our time, so I just wanted to jump in here and just ask Gerald if he's got a final question or two he'd like to ask, and then Rebecca, over to you for your closing remarks. But we'll probably start winding down in a second. So Gerald, final questions.
Yeah, so the final question I had, in our previous discussions, you said that you were working on some other projects. Can you share with us the new projects you're working on?
Yeah, no, I'd love to. So I have 2 projects that are kind of building from this book project. The first one is about militarized masculinity and authoritarianism, because, you know, as we've kind of talked about, the majority of people that I worked with in my research and spoke with were young men. And so thinking about the role that masculinity plays in holding up these systems, and in particular, the way that it allows national level power to be projected to the grassroots and to shape not just public spaces, but also private spaces. So I have an exploratory article that's out in International Affairs on that this past year, but I hope to develop it into a comparative project. And then I'm also working now on developing this sort of theory or argument of arbitrary states, to think not just about how regimes govern their domestic population, but also what it might mean for a regime's engagement at an international level. And so, you know, if we think about how these authoritarian regimes are using the law to govern domestically, that tells us that it's something about the state form, you know, constitutionalism, and therefore can tell us something about the way these states engage internationally. And most of the scholarship that we have at the moment on sort of legal authoritarianism and the rule of law, especially in an international sphere, is on kind of these globally leading states, Russia, China. And we have much less of an understanding of how the world's lower capacity states, where indeed most authoritarian regimes will be found, actually engage and pursue their strategies. And so very briefly, you know, what I think we see with something like arbitrary governance is that unlike states like China or Russia that might sort of be able to forcibly and directly pursue their interests, for example, by redefining what human rights means, countries like Uganda can't necessarily throw their weight around like that. And so what tactics and strategies do they use to still pursue those same goals, but given their different sort of global standing?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for sharing with us the thoughts from your books. Thank you very much. Nic, do you have something to say? I hand over now back to you.
Thank you very much. Well, first to thank you. I asked excellent questions, and I think that was a really great discussion. I'm sure the viewers are going to really enjoy it. So thank you so much for joining us. We really Second, to congratulate Rebecca. This is a fabulous book and it's really good quality analysis. And you can tell from the pages how much hard work went into this. And I think that's something that's worth saying as well. It's a really important book with big arguments, but it's based on really serious fieldwork, or as I think we're now saying, in-country research, because we're moving away from fieldwork as a term due to its potential exoticizing of research in countries like Uganda. So I think it's really important to say that, as you brought out, I think very well in your questions, this is a book that's really rooted in a really close understanding of peoples and places, but then building an argument on the back of that that extends beyond Uganda. And that's what's so exciting about this book. So congratulations, Rebecca. We know how tough it is to write books. Congratulations on bringing it out. Thanks so much for joining us. And I look forward to seeing the responses of our readers and viewers to your work over the next few months. And of course, when your very exciting new research projects come to fruition, come back to Democracy in Africa and talk to us about them. Thanks very much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Thank you.
Thank you.